Welcome everyone. This video I'll show you how I turned scrap cardboard, paper, and a tea light into this rustic potbelly stove. I start out by marking the height of the tea light base onto scrap cardboard. I cut some strips of cardboard from this piece of an Amazon box the height of my tea light. With the strips that I cut, I'm trying to form a square frame around the tea light. I have never made a potbelly stove with a tea light before, but I've really been wanting to give it a try. So you're seeing me make this up as I go. I was going to remove the housing around the tea light, but I decided to keep it. I'm trying to create it in a way where I can replace the tea light or especially the battery easily. I've put the masking tape on the corners to hopefully reinforce the corners, since I may need to pop the light in and out in the future. I need to cover the top of this base piece now. I decided I would trace it, but I probably could have glued it down and cut it out instead. Sometimes I think I like to just go about it the hard way. Before I glued the top on, I pushed it on the top of the tip of the light to make an impression. That way I knew exactly where I needed to cut the hole for the light. And of course, lots of masking tape. I say it's for reinforcement, or do I just want to play with masking tape? I thought I better add some glue to the seams on the inside for some strength too. I'm checking the size out in the room to make sure it's not too big. I drew out a little foot for the base the best I could. I'm really not that great at drawing. I made 4 of them out of scrap cardstock, about 6 layers thick, I think, for each one. I wasn't going to completely cut all the cardboard away from the hole for the light, but I thought it would let more light pass through. At first, I was going to remove the light to glue in the feet, but it turned out better to leave them in. It helped everything stay snug and not move while the glue was drying. And here I'm checking the balance, making sure it doesn't wobble too much. I'm surprised how easy it was to build this base. I really need to cover the sides now to hide the masking tape and give a smoother finish. I used some scrap cardstock to cover all 4 sides. I didn't want to just add the potbelly stove onto the base like it was, so I created another frame piece and I glued it onto the base. Then I was a little worried about something I hadn't thought about, the light shining down onto the floor through the plastic under the stove. So I figured I should give it a test first to see how much it did light up the floor. I figured I would paint the inside of the tea light first, but I thought if I lined it with some masking tape before painting, that would help block more light. I didn't want to apply any tape or paint to the light fixture area itself, so I cut a circle the same size and I will use 2-way stick tape to apply it. There were 3 little nubs I needed to sand flush that would allow the circle to lay flat. I painted the inside of the light housing right over the masking tape, and I painted around the bottom outside edge of the fixture piece too. I did a quick test and it worked. Cut some more scrap strips of cardstock to cover the sides of that piece that I added to the top of the base. And now I'm tracing this top area to make a piece to cover it too. I had to cut an opening for the light to pass through. I cut it a little larger than I needed though to make sure that lots of light passes through there. I almost glued on the top and then I realized I better pack some foil around the light to help reflect more light if possible. I just hot glued some recycled foil all around the light. I tried to fill in all the gaps around it really well, and then I glued the top on. I used some watered down paper clay to fill in the cracks on the corners, and I softened all of the edges with a little bit of sanding. I had this piece left over from my galvanized tubs video, and I thought it would be perfect to try to form the body of the potbelly stove. I cut off a portion of it and kept rolling it and trying the fit. I was finally happy with this shape and I made a mark where it was lapped over. That way it leaves an area for the glue and makes it easier to join the 2 ends. I cut close to the mark but left a little bit of room for glue, and then I attached the other end and held in place for a second or so. And then I remembered I had these clips from Dollar Tree that would hold it perfectly. I wanted the top half of the Potbelly stove to be taller. So this piece of the cardstock I had to cut down just a little bit. To me, the hardest part was making the opening match as closely as possible to the bottom half. I marked and glued it the same as I did for the bottom half. I also tried to trim the bottom and top as even as I could. Once the top half was dry, I drew a little window so that I would be able to see the glow of the fire. That may not be realistic, but I wanted it because I wanted it to have that glow of the fire. I glued the two halves together and covered the seam with masking tape to keep the light from passing through the cracks. I cut a long strip of cardstock and glued it over the tape and the area where the top and the bottom met. For a little bit of interest, I cut a skinnier strip and glued it over the previous wider one. I didn't show it here, but I did spritz the cardstock with a little bit of water to make it easier to form around the Potbelly stove. I'm testing the fit and the height here. I didn't like the gap the strip of cardstock left at the top and the bottom, so I covered it with this paper string I made prior to this video. It was actually an experiment. I ran it along the top and the bottom of the strip, and I also cut short pieces and glued them to the sides of the bottom half of the Potbelly stove. I thought it would look like welding or something. And then I glued it down to the base. I used a lot of glue, hoping it would fill in any of those gaps that may let light pass through. I had this interesting piece in my scraps, and I want to use it to make it look like there was a door for cleaning out the ashes, possibly. It was too wide, so I had to cut it down a little. I had a couple of them, so I layered one on top of the other. I thought that little area between the base and the Potbelly stove seemed kind of boring, and it looked like it needed something, so I thought I would cut some strips of this cardstock and just glue strips of that all the way around to add a little bit more interest to it. I took some paper doilies and added some texture to the base with those. You can always experiment with different shapes of doilies and cut out certain sections to give yourself different looks. I really like the subtle texture that they add, especially at the end when you might be dry brushing or using chalk pastels. I also used some crochet thread that I had stiffened with glue to look like vents. And then I started looking at all of my weird paper scraps and embellished it even more. Here I was trying to create like a little vent using some of the circle cutouts and the stiffened thread. I even paper quilled some skinny strips of paper to be hinges and knobs. I always have so much fun just looking at reference pictures and adding in all kinds of different little details, whether it's paper quilled or with the stiffened thread. I need to cover this opening and make it look like a hinged door you can open. The curved scraps were perfect for this, and then I embellished it with some of the crochet thread that I had stiffened with glue and a little bit of paper quilling. I wanted to first give it a couple of coats of gesso to unify everything and also fill in any gaps that may try to let light peek through. And then I gave it a couple of coats of black paint to make it look like cast iron. I almost didn't, but I decided to paint some black inside. It was a bad idea because it really cut down on the brightness of the tea light. So I colored some recycled foil with some red and orange and yellow Sharpies and glued that to the inside to help reflect the light a little bit more. I also colored some scrap pieces of clear acrylic packaging. I really could have used some candy wrappers like butterscotch candies or something red or orange, but I didn't have any. But the cast iron was too clean, so I brushed it all over with some white chalk pastel to make it look like it's been used and dirty. I cut a couple of large circles for the top of the stove and one that was just a little bit smaller. The chimney was a hot mess, but somehow I made it work. I rolled 2 cylinders for the chimney. I glued short strips of paper on one at a time to create the curve in the chimney. I painted it all with gesso and wood glue to hide all of the imperfections. Then I painted it all black like the Potbelly stove. It turned out okay considering the mess it was to create, but since it is a stove that probably gets used a lot, it's just fine. And we're talking about the Old West. I need to check it out in the room now. I'm turning on the little light now and turning off the lights to see how it looks. Once I have the second floor on, I will have more light in the room than just the Potbelly stove. I'm super happy with how this stove turned out, and hopefully it inspires you to look at your scraps and see what you can come up with. As always, thank you so very much for watching.